Welcome to the latest Gramophone Classical Music Podcast. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and for this week's episode, I met up with the brilliant pianist Martin James Bartlett to talk about his new album featuring music by Bach, Mozart and Britten. You can listen to our conversation, along with some excerpts from the album, which is out next week on Warner Classics, in just a moment. This podcast episode is brought to you in association with REMA, the European Early Music Network, and the organisers of Early Music Day, an exciting event to which all organisations in the sector and all early music lovers and audiences are invited to be a part. It takes place on the 21st of March, the spring equinox, and the birthday of Johann Sebastian Bach, and REMA are delighted to welcome the recorder virtuosos Lucy Horsch and Sarah Jeffrey as this year's ambassadors. All contributions, be they concerts, masterclasses, conferences, interviews, behind-the-scenes videos and educational content are welcome. So to find out how you can get involved in this celebration of early music, visit earlymusicday.eu. Welcome to this week's Gramophone Podcast. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and today I am delighted to welcome the fabulous pianist Martin James Bartlett onto the podcast to talk about his new recording of the music of Bach, Britten and Mozart, available on the Warner Classics label from February the 27th. Martin, hello.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Martin.
Now, I understand your starting point for this hugely enjoyable album was in fact its closing work, Benjamin Britten's Young Apollo. This is an early work from Britten from 1939 when he was aged just 25, and crucially one he premiered himself. And I say crucially because it's Britten as a performer that's particularly inspired you here for this programme. Explain what you mean by that.
I mean, of course, Britten is one of those triple threats like Rachmaninoff, a terrific conductor, a wonderful pianist and composer. And I think lots of people obviously just see him as the composer, quite rightly, that he is extraordinarily, wonderfully talented. But I wanted to explore the world of his collaborative work. And I remember watching tapes of him performing with Sviatoslav Richter. There's a wonderful one of them playing the Mozart D major piano sonata for two pianos, and Richter actually making a couple of bum notes, which is very unlike Richter. But you sort of see Britten flying over the keys with such ease and sort of gives him a look in his direction. And you just think, wow, he really did have it all. And he also, of course, longtime collaborator and partner to Peter Pears. And those recordings are very special to me as well. So I wanted to kind of understand all the influences that made Britten. And of course, starting with Bach seemed a very logical next step.
Now, before we go on to the Bach, let's just talk about Young Apollo. It's a rather splendidly virtuosic work, but one he put away almost immediately. And indeed, it wasn't heard again until 1979, 4 decades later. First, he introduced the work, and then do you know why he just decided he didn't want to play it again?
Well, I mean, it is sort of shrouded in mystery a little bit. There are a couple of theories. I mean, some that he just didn't think it was necessarily worthy because it's not quite tonally, perhaps, as intricate as some of his other works. However, I think the fact that it's so monochromatic in a way that it's just bright is the allure of the piece to me, because it's all about the sun god and it has that ball of energy in it. But also, I think it has a romantic element to it. We know that he wrote it when he was in love with a young German man, and then that relationship sort of found its end when he ended up in a war camp, actually, the other chap, and then he met Peter Pears, and that developed. And I wonder whether there was an issue with the personal life of this music. Actually, they actually discovered this not so young German man actually a couple of years ago in his 90s, who was living with his wife of 70 years. And they spoke to him and found all of these letters he'd kept from Benjamin Britten over all the years. And actually, I believe there's a composition that's based around all these letters. So an extraordinary story around the work.
Now, to return to the beginning of the album, you open it with Johann Sebastian Bach's Keyboard Concerto No. 1 in D minor. And this takes us all the way back to the 3rd decade of the 18th century. Tell me about the inclusion of that on this recording. You've talked a little bit there about Britten's being influenced by Bach, but why this particular work?
This, for me, it is the first in this way keyboard concerto. One hasn't come before it. And it in itself is deeply inspired by what has come before, such as Vivaldi and all of these elements. But it also looks very far forward into the future as to what was to come. So I like the fact that it shows influence, but also shows the future. Britten himself loved Bach. We know that hugely, very much, especially through the War Requiem. There's so much influence he takes from Bach. And for me, it's just a masterpiece. I also love it that it's quite dark. It's in this key of D minor. It has a brooding sense to it, I think, and it is quite powerful. And I love that similarity, but also juxtaposition to the Britten that ends the album, that is also very powerful, but in a brilliant, light way.
Yes, absolutely. And you wrote that you think, or it's thought that this was written for another instrument originally. I mean, is that just because it was one of the first keyboard concertos? Probably that was its origins, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of speculation that I've read on papers online that actually, yes, it was written for another instrument and then was adapted, and that Bach hadn't probably intended for it to be in this form, but then it had evolved into this absolute masterpiece of a work. It is a fabulous piece of music. I love it.
Yes, no, it sounds like a lot of collaborative fun to play. And then we're stepping forwards a few more decades to 1777, Mozart's Violon Concerto, his ninth piano concerto. Mozart was 21, so even younger than Britten was here when he wrote his Young Apollo. And like the Bach, this also feels like a real sort of step change in composition. And you said earlier that the piano immediately comes in. There's not even this introduction. There's just a few notes, very little bit of music, and then it immediately comes. So Mozart was clearly already sort of exploring, experimenting, slightly changing the way we think of the genre.
Very much so. I mean, for me, Mozart is the pinnacle of classical music. I mean, and Beethoven is extraordinary and took it forward, but for me, Mozart's always my boy when it comes to this kind of music. And I just think there's so many interesting elements to this concerto. Again, like the Young Apollo, it's shrouded in a little bit of mystery. People got the title wrong. Nobody knew quite what it meant. They thought it was the Young Man Concerto. It isn't the Young Man Concerto. It kind of undermines the fact I put it with the Young Apollo, doesn't it? But never mind. We'll move on from that. It's not the Young Man Concerto. It was actually written, yes, for this young dancer, Jeune Amie. But I think the reason why they got a bit confused is because Mozart's French was so appalling that he sort of butchered her name, that it sounded like jeune homme. So then it all got very confused. However, we know it was written for her, so much so that in the last movement, he includes this beautiful dance in the middle. And I think that was probably an attempt perhaps to get her father on his side, because her father was a wonderful dancer and basically, well, the father of modern dance, actually, in the sense that World Dance Day, of which I cannot tell you which day it is of the year, is actually his birthday. It was written for this young lady who was a dancer, and that's why, in the end, he includes this beautiful dance passage in otherwise a presto, fiery last movement. Yeah.
No, it is. There's lots of sort of nice coloristic lyricism in there, and again, just some atmospheric virtuosity. It's quite an extraordinary work.
I love it, and actually it's one of the ones that you can also play with a string quartet as well, which is a lovely thing that you can also include it in a chamber setting, which is quite nice, which is how it works alongside the Bach and things, is that it works as a piece. It feels to me very much like a piece of chamber music.
And that's quite an interesting way to move into my next point. I mean, it sounds on record like a really joyous meeting of musical spirits. The Mozarteum Orchestra, Salzburg, and Howard Griffiths, based, of course, in a city associated with Mozart's youth. Another nice link to the programme.
The joy for me, I adore London very much, and I've spent My last few albums I spent recording in London. Usually the weather has been appalling. However, for two of my albums, it has snowed, which is somewhat unusual, I think. And this is another one where it snowed because I arrived in Salzburg to record, and for the 4 or 5 days we were there was snow on the ground the whole time. And for me, it was wonderful because it felt a little bit like a musical pilgrimage. You know, I got to go to the town of Mozart's youth. I got to spend time with an orchestra named after him, and I got to play the piece that he wrote when he was there. Also, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was very lucky to have a masterclass with Sir Andras Schiff in Salzburg on this exact piece. So all of those coincidences came together. And when I was in Salzburg, I walked along the streets and I felt like he could have popped around any corner. Mozart or Andras Schiff, to be honest, either one. But it was wonderful. I even went to restaurants that served sort of they still have this historical love of Mozart, and they serve some of his famous dishes like Tafelspitz and all kinds of boiled dumplings and quite hearty fare. So I felt pretty close as one can feel to Mozart in this day and age.
Yeah. And tell me about the piano you chose for the recording, a Bösendorfer.
Yeah, well, I mean, when in Austria, play a Bösendorfer, we were thinking about what to do with the piano. And for me, Mozart just shines through beautifully on a Bösendorfer. To be honest, I was a little apprehensive as to how the Britten would fare, because of course the Britten requires an instrument with a huge amount of velocity and power. So I was wondering how that would be. I had the most joyous time going to Bösendorfer in Vienna and looking through. I think they got out about 6 or 7 concert grands for me to look through. And when I sat down and tried this one, it was the piano for the job. Within a couple of seconds, the harmonies, the way they felt, the way the touch was, it needed no adjustment. It was just, I knew it was right. And I think it's just got such a bell-like tone. And in the Mozart, all of the passage work, it's not evened out. You know, the sound isn't even. It actually has a slight nuance to each note. And it's a bit like if you see a beautiful Rembrandt and the way he paints pearls and things, they look beautiful from a distance. And when you get closer, they're all just ever so slightly different. And that's how I felt about this piano, is it had this capacity to provide such an interesting line in the music. So I was super happy with the choice of instrument.
Yeah, no, it sounds amazing, and also provides a nice sort of continuity between what otherwise are quite stylistically different eras of music.
Yes, exactly. And actually, I'm very lucky to be doing a launch of this album in Vienna at the Bösendorfer, their wonderful place they have just tucked into the Musikverein. So I feel very, very lucky to have that collaboration with them.
Yeah. And it's a wonderful program. I mean, is it a program that could be performed live? It makes for a wonderful sort of listen from beginning to end.
Yes, I mean, I guess it would be a slightly short evening program, but also a slightly longer lunchtime. I think if you had a little bit of talking in between and perhaps explaining the connections, it could be a brilliant evening concert. The way I approach records is from actually a recital element. You know, I don't want a record that is just put together because it's sort of all stuff I know well and want to present. I want it to be something that I could imagine I were in a hall perhaps listening to, and that journey. So for me, I'm very glad you think it could work on a concert stage, because that is also at the starting point for all of the albums I've made is, would this be a nice evening basically for people to hear?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful way of thinking of programming, I think. Just a reminder that Martin James Bartlett's album featuring Bach's Keyboard Concerto No. 1, Mozart's Jeannon Concerto, and Britten's Young Apollo, recorded with the Mozarteum Orchestra, Salzburg, and Howard Griffiths, is available from Warner Classics from Friday, 27th of February, though there are some advanced tracks available to stream now. Martin James Bartlett, thank you very much indeed.
Lovely to chat, thanks.
Thank you for downloading this edition of the Gramophone Podcast. If you've enjoyed it, we'd be hugely grateful if you could leave a rating or a review, hit the subscribe button, or simply tell your friends about our work. And if you want to explore classical music in even greater depth with Gramophone, then we produce a monthly magazine packed full of interviews, features and reviews, as well as a website with even more exciting classical coverage to explore and enjoy. And all listeners to this podcast can get a 20% discount off any subscription package by visiting gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and entering the code podcast20 at the checkout. Thank you to our sponsors of this week's episode, REMA, the European Early Music Network, and the organisers of Early Music Day, which takes place on March the 21st. And just a reminder to visit earlymusicday.eu, where you can find out all about this very exciting event. And do join us again for another Gramophone podcast next week.